Hello. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for VMware's multi-cloud live stream. My name is Lauren, and joining me today is my co-host, David Jasso. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the live stream. We're excited to be here with you today.
Great, yeah. And just as a reminder to the audience that these live stream demos will be taking place every week on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We'll be featuring new speakers and topics, and the recordings will also be hosted on our VMware Cloud channel, so you can watch them on demand. So we encourage you to subscribe to the channel, stay up to date with the latest. And today,
just a comment there. Just so people know, we'll have a full schedule starting in July, but I don't think we have anything coming up the next week or so.
Yep, with the summer holidays and everything. And also today, we're excited to have Kyle Gleed here with us today. Kyle, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. So my name's Kyle Gleed. I'm part of the technical marketing team at VMware, looking after VMware Cloud Foundation, and my specific focus is on running Kubernetes on top of Cloud Foundation.
Perfect. Thank you. And as a final reminder before we jump into the presentation and the demo, just wanted to give a reminder to feel free to add your questions if you're joining us live into the chat, and we'll be happy to address those as we go along. So with that, Kyle, I'll let you introduce the topic today and dive in.
All right, great. Thank you. So welcome. So today I'm here to talk about running Kubernetes on top of VMware Cloud Foundation with Tanzu. And so I have a few slides I'm going to go over, and we're going to talk about the high-level overview of what are all these new terms, what are all these components, how do they all come together, and then we'll switch over and actually go through some demos where I'll actually show an example of using the Cloud Foundation and particularly the SDDC Manager in order to automate a lot of the tasks that are involved with setting up and enabling Kubernetes, and particularly when it comes to running Kubernetes workloads at scale in your on-premises data center. So with that, let's jump into the slides here. And again, if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the comments field, and I will I'll do my best to kind of watch that and answer those as they come in. So we will be talking about basically, modern applications. We talk about running Kubernetes, but why do we run Kubernetes? Well, because we want to run these new types of application workloads. Microservices, modern apps, containers and VMs running side by side. But basically, we want to be able to run these containers at scale on our infrastructure. And Kubernetes is a great way to do that. And now with vSphere 7 and with the vSphere with Tanzu, which is part of Cloud Foundation, we make that very easy for our customers. And so the way it works, well, if we step back and we look at why are we doing this, why do we need to run Kubernetes on top of the infrastructure in our data center? You think about it, you think most developers are pretty comfortable with going out to the public cloud today. That's where they've been working. It's very easy to stand up Kubernetes environments in the public cloud. But when developers go out to the public cloud and they're kind of doing this on their own, and the IT organization is not involved, the vSphere admin, the VCF admin is not involved, it can create challenges for the organization because if the developer came to a vSphere admin today and said, hey, I need a place to do some work. Okay, the vSphere admin is going to be like, okay, great. How many VMs do you need? Because that's the way we think as vSphere admins. We think about virtual infrastructure. We think about virtual machines. And people come to us, they want services. Sure, we can give them virtual machines. That's our job. That's what we do. But the developer's not really asking for virtual machines. He's asking for a place to do some work. And so in his world, what that means is I need a Kubernetes environment. I need an API. I need an IP address. I need to be able to send some kubectl commands with some YAML manifests and be able to have those workloads running. And that's really what he's asking for. So the developer's asking the VCF admin for a place to do some work, but the answer he's getting is not necessarily the answer he wanted. And so that ends up basically there's confusion there. And these two teams, they need to work together. And so the developer has to come back and say, well, no, I really don't want VMs. What I want is Kubernetes. And then the vSphere admin will say, well, I know Kubernetes can run inside of Linux. So if I spin up some Linux VMs, can you build your own Kubernetes cluster? And that back and forth is going to lead to delays. It's going to cause problems. for the developer, because the developer just wants to get going. They want to ask for it 2 hours later, they want to be going. They don't want to ask for it and then 2 weeks later finally get an environment. So we need to bring these two worlds together. We need to get the developers and the IT admins, and one, they need to be able to talk the same language, and they need to be able to work on the same infrastructure, and they need to be able to view and manage the same objects. So if a developer comes to me and says, hey, I need a place to do some work, I could say, sure, here's a control plane IP address, here's your credentials, go ahead, log in, start deploying your Kubernetes-based workloads. If he comes to me and says, hey, I'm having a problem with one of my workloads, I can go in the vSphere web client, I can look and see the health, the status of that, just like he can go into kubectl, run a command and see the health and status. And we're looking at the same objects, we're talking about the same components, and we're working together. And that's really what we're trying to do with VCF with Tanzu, is to bring those two worlds together and overcome those challenges. So in doing that, we got the developer working side by side with the operator, and they're able to, the admin or the operator, and they're able to work together, and the developer will now see that IT organization, that admin who's working with, as being just as responsive as, say, he went out to the public cloud. Okay, so how do we do this? So with VCF with Tanzu, we talk about this idea of developer-ready infrastructure, and we talk about being able to provide that developer-ready infrastructure in just a few hours. So the developer request comes in and says, hey, I need a place to do some work. Okay, so again, he's asking for a cluster API, a Kubernetes API. He's asking for a place, to authenticate, to run commands, pass YAML manifest, and he's wanting to consume that as opposed to go and build it himself. So he comes to the VCF operator in this example. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our vSphere web client, and we're going to create this new component called a namespace. Now, a namespace might be something that might be new to you if you haven't used the Kubernetes capabilities built into vSphere. But essentially, a namespace is just a resource pool of sorts, but it's how we're going to basically control authentication and control access to our Kubernetes instance. It's also how we're going to be able to throttle and limit how much of the capacity developers can use. So I can have multiple namespaces. I can have different teams of developers spread across these namespaces. And as these developers log in, it's going to use vCenter SSO for authentication. So if you have Active Directory registered as an identity source, you can use your Active Directory credentials to log in. So we're going to be able to gate access through authentication. That comes through vCenter SSO. And then once they're authenticated, we can go in and set limits in terms of how much CPU, how much memory, how much storage they can access. So I can have teams of developers working together on the same vSphere cluster with some boundaries in place to ensure that only authorized developers get access, and those authorized developers go and access the resources they've been now allocated. Okay, so once that's done, you'll create that namespace, you'll set up those access and those quotas, and then you'll basically go in and you'll hand off this environment to the developer. So now from the VCF operator standpoint, you're just providing infrastructure to the developer. And from the developer, this is just a pool of capacity that they can use in a kind of a self-service type consumption model. They're going to log in, and they're going to use a special version of the kubectl command in order to log in. And this version basically includes a vSphere plugin. So they'll have a command they'll run to log in. Once they log in, they'll be able to go in and start deploying their workloads. And they can do this in a couple of different ways. On Cloud Foundation with NSX, they can deploy what we call pod VMs, which are containers running natively on top of ESXi. Or they can go out and deploy Tanzu Kubernetes clusters, which are these guest clusters wherein the developer can control the size, the version, and it's a fully upstream conformant version of Kubernetes running on that pool of capacity they've been given access to. And so that's kind of in a nutshell how it works. You again bringing that developer together with that VCF operator and bringing them together. And so this experience from the developer is going to be the same on Cloud Foundation as they would get from, say, VMC on AWS or in a public cloud. They just basically talking to an API, and they're using their kubectl and their YAML manifest, and it looks and feels the same to them as though they were, regardless of where they're running this at. Okay. So now in terms of Cloud Foundation and VMware Cloud Foundation, so VMware Cloud Foundation is our SDDC solution. So this is the full stack. So VMware, we have many products. We have vSphere, we have vSAN, we have NSX, we have the vRealize suite. And if we bring all these products together into what we call the full stack, that is the software-defined data center. That's where you have software-defined compute with software-defined storage, with software-defined networking, with cloud management, all bundled into an integrated solution. And with Cloud Foundation, we have productize this into a solution that can be installed in your data center. And it has automation through the SDDC Manager that's going to allow you to go in and automate a lot of the tasks involved with standing up and deploying and managing your infrastructure. So things like deploying vCenter servers, creating clusters, deploying and configuring NSX, creating NSX edge clusters and tier 0 routers and tier 1 routers and segments. That's all going to be automated through the SDDC Manager as part of Cloud Foundation. And because the Cloud Foundation is built on the full stack, we have capabilities around automating the deployment of both virtual machines, software-defined storage, software-defined networkings, and then we also have integration with the vRealize suite. And so really, this is our full stack solution, and this solution is really geared towards customers who want to run enterprise-class Kubernetes at scale in their data center. And of course, these building blocks that make up Cloud Foundation, the product that I'm talking about, are the same building blocks that we run in the public cloud as part of VMC on AWS or as part of any VMware on pick your public cloud solution. So it's all built on vSphere, NSX, vSAN, and with vRealize as that cloud management. And so this is kind of what it looks like from a high level. And after I go through this, we'll jump into the demo. But essentially, you know, I have these developers, I have these vSphere admins, and these developers come to me and say, hey, I need a place to do some work. So the vSphere admin can go into their vSphere cluster. They can enable this Tanzu capability, and they can create these namespaces, and those developers can start doing their work. And inevitably, once they get going, there's going to be more developers come along, and there's going to be more namespaces created, and you're going to need to be able to scale this solution out. But what happens once we get to the point where the number of developers exceeds our capacity for a specific cluster? Well, at this point, we're going to need to go in and stand some more infrastructure. And this is where the SDDC Manager and Cloud Foundation comes in, because now we can leverage the automation to spin up a new cluster where we can create new namespaces in order to support more developers. Now, let's say while we're doing this, our previous cluster is running, it's starting to become memory constrained. We need to make it larger. Again, we can go into the SDDC Manager, we can use the automation, and we can make that cluster bigger. And we can basically make this very easy to scale up and scale out by leveraging the automation. So as you need more clusters, you go to deploy more clusters through the SDDC Manager. If you need to separate environments with different vCenter servers, you create different workload domains. All the NSX, all the networking, all that complexity that's typically, a lot of times a learning curve for a lot of our people getting started. It's easy with Cloud Foundation because we're going to automate it. We automate the deployment of NSX. We automate the creation of the NSX edge clusters. It's fully automated, and we're basically leveraging the automation infrastructure, the infrastructure automation capabilities of Cloud Foundation through the SDDC Manager. We're marrying that together with the Tanzu capabilities built into vSphere with Tanzu in order to kind of provide this best of both worlds type solution. So I kind of got ahead of myself on the slides, but what I just said, I'll just kind of summarize again. So we're taking the automation capabilities of the SDDC Manager through the creation of workload domains and clusters, and that's all part of VMware Cloud Foundation. We're marrying that together with vSphere with Tanzu, and that's our VMware Cloud Foundation with Tanzu.
That's excellent.
Okay.
Really cool.
All right. So, any questions about that? We're getting ready. I'm going to jump into some demos here, and I'm just basically going to show an example of going into an environment and deploying Cloud Foundation, point you to some resources where you can go and look at after this call is over. I don't see any comments, so I'll just keep going. But again, if you have those...
One thing I'd just like to jump in and add is that for those that might not be super familiar with Cloud Foundation, effectively, that technology stack is the same stack that we now can run on AWS and also on Azure and Google Platform and Google Cloud Platform and Oracle and Alibaba, and I'm sure I missed one of the major partners in hyperscalers, but that's sort of the beauty of this, is that you can extend that technology stack into, any cloud domain, and over, we have thousands of managed service provider partners as well. So it was a really nice introduction, Kyle, to the VMware Cloud Foundation with Tanzu. So it's awesome.
All right, thank you. All right, well, so let's go ahead now. So this is a kind of a messy diagram, but I'll try and simplify here. But what I'm showing you here is I'm showing you an example of a Cloud Foundation workload domain running Kubernetes workloads. And essentially what you'll see here is I want to call your attention to is there's 6 basic steps with enabling Kubernetes on a Cloud Foundation workload domain. The first one is we have to create a workload domain, and that's represented here by this dark blue box, and that's done from the SDDC Manager. Okay, we're going to go in, and each workload domain is going to have a dedicated vCenter server, one or more vSphere clusters, as well as an NSXT fabric associated with it. Now, you have your choice in terms of storage. In my examples, I use vSAN, so I'm using software-defined storage, but you can also use NFS or Fiber Channel as well inside of a Cloud Foundation workload domain. But you'll go in and you'll use the automation to create that. So how long did it take? What would it take you today if I came to you and said, hey, I need you to stand up a new vSphere environment? How long do you think it would take? You know, typically those answers come in from a day or two to maybe a week, because you have to go out and you have to talk to networking people, get IP addresses, figure out vMotion, vSAN networks, make sure switches get configured, make sure you got storage. There's a lot of work that goes into that, and that just takes time to complete. With Cloud Foundation, you kind of got this infrastructure in place, and it takes me about 90 minutes to go in and create a new workload domain. So you start to see some of those cost savings. But once you create the workload domain, the next step is to go in and configure NSX. Whenever you start with Kubernetes, if you're just getting started, one of the first things you'll quickly realize is that networking is a very integral part of Kubernetes. And having a good understanding of the underlying networking and all the different networking configurations and options is something you have to work through. Fortunately, with Cloud Foundation with Tanzu, we have NSX built into the solution. And we have the NSX container plugin, which provides this easy interface for interfacing with and creating these underlying NSX objects. So I go into the SDDC Manager, I create my edge cluster, and I can go into vSphere, enable Kubernetes, and a lot of that complexity in the networking is going to be masked behind the scenes because it's going to be automated through Cloud Foundation. Once I create that NSX Edge cluster, I'll enable the supervisor cluster, and then I go in and I create my namespaces. And that's in the kind of a nutshell, the process. And since we're kind of limited on time here, I don't want to spend too much time doing this as much as I want to shift gears now and actually go to this place. So actually, you'll notice here I'm at a website called core.vmware.com. Okay, and you can go here, you can log in. And you should have access to all these demos. Pretty much everything I have is customer facing. It's publicly accessible. But let me go back here and let me just kind of go to when I first log in to just show you how to navigate and how to get here. So you come in, you'll see at VMware, I'm part of what we call our Cloud Platform Business Unit, CPBU. And that we're broken into 3 different groups. We have the VMware Cloud Foundation group. We have, of course, the vSphere group. And then we have the vSAN or the storage group. So for this, since we're talking about Cloud Foundation, we're talking about Kubernetes on Cloud Foundation, we'll go into the Cloud Foundation section here. And then when you come in, you'll see here, there's a number of different featured assets and solutions. And one of those is developer-ready infrastructure, delivering developer-ready infrastructure. And if I click on that, it will bring me to a place where I can see all the assets that are currently there. And these are getting updated quite frequently. So you'll want to be sure to check back if you don't find what you need, or if you have any ideas on something, give us feedback. We're happy to create things. But you'll notice I have some sizing information in terms of how to size the Cloud Foundation in preparation for running Kubernetes workloads. I also have these step-by-step demos to show basically the steps to go in and to deploy and configure Kubernetes on top of Cloud Foundation. And then I also have these videos, which are basically a video of these click-throughs. So I got it in multiple formats. And then we also got some things down here about working with pod VMs and deploying Tanzu Kubernetes clusters. So these are the resources available to you. And what I want to focus on today is this step-by-step guide. And you'll notice when we're looking at that slide before, I called out 6 different areas. And you'll see here, I got 6 different demos, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So these kind of coincide with that slide in terms of the steps to go through. So the first thing we got is we're talking about creating a VI workload domain. So if you're not familiar with the SDDC Manager, this is a good demo to go in and basically just show you how the automation is used to go in and create a workload domain. So for example, a little bit about the platform here, you'll notice that it's got some notes here on the right. So as you're going out and you're doing this after we're done with this call and you're just doing it on your own, you can read the notes and it will explain what's going on. And these little orange boxes will kind of help you navigate so you can kind of follow through. I'm going to leave them up just to help with the flow of the demo here. But the first thing we'll do is we're going in, and this is our SDDC Manager dashboard. And this is where we're going to go in and manage our private cloud. So this is where we go in, we see our inventory of hosts, we see our workload domains, we see how many clusters, and we can go in and manage that. So in order to create a new workload domain, I have to have hosts that are available. So if I go in here to the host tab and I go to unassigned hosts, you'll see in my inventory, I have a number of hosts. These are servers with ESXi installed that are sitting there ready to be used. So think of a public cloud and think of them having all this capacity is just waiting for customers to come in and sign up for. This is our private cloud. This is our capacity. It's just waiting for business units to come in and start allocating and consuming. And of course, it's all gated. You need to have administrative rights and stuff. So it's not like people can go in and grab resources they're not allowed to. But you'll come in here and you'll see the list. And the key here is we have hosts, and these hosts are available to us. So now we can go to workload domains. And under workload domains, I can create workload domain, and there's a VI for virtual infrastructure. This is just your standard kind of vCenter environment with one cluster. And here's where you choose your storage type. So as I mentioned, we're going to use vSAN in my demos, but you can use NFS or Fiber Channel as well. And then we're going to go in and provide some information about this. This workload domain is going to need a name. We're going to assign an organization, and then we're going to choose how we're going to do updates. So part of what SDDC Manager is going to do, in addition to deploying the infrastructure, it's going to apply software updates over time. So do lifecycle management. With vSphere 7, we now have two options. We can use baseline-based approach or the traditional VUM-based approach, or we can use VLCM, which is that new vSphere Lifecycle Manager. And that's what you're choosing here with these options. We're just going to go with the default for VUM because with this version, that's the version that's required for Kubernetes. Okay, and we'll go ahead and click Next. And then I'm going to give it my cluster name. So remember, we've got to have at least one cluster. This is going to be my first cluster. I'm just going to call this WLD01-cluster01. So workload domain 01, cluster 1. And I'm going to click Next. And then I'm going to deploy a new vCenter server as part of this. So I need to give it the IP address as well as the set the username and password, the initial password for root. So I'm going to do that. So you'll see I got my IP address, my fully qualified host name, and then I've got my gateway along with my root user password typed twice to verify I get that right. Okay. And then because this is the first workload domain, I need to create a new NSXT fabric. If this was a second or third or fourth workload domain, I'd have a choice to join the existing fabric or create a new fabric. But again, NSX is built in. So I'm going to go ahead and provide the details for NSX. And again, remember, one of the key advantages of VMware Cloud Foundation is it's going to help make NSX easy for us. So a lot of times, myself, I know I wasn't really a network person. I hadn't really worked with networking when I started with this. NSX was a big a lot for me to learn, but having Cloud Foundation SDDC Manager really helped me because it was able to automate a lot of those tasks like installing and configuring and prepping host, creating edge clusters. That's all automated for me. So next I go in, I select the host. When you select the host, you have to select a minimum of 3 hosts. We recommend 4 when using vSAN because of the availability and redundancy, but 3 is the minimum required number of hosts for a cluster in a Cloud Foundation workload domain. In this environment, we're just going to do 3, click Next, and then we'll assign our license keys. And once that's done, you'll see it's going to come up and show me a list of the object names. So based on the input parameters I provided, it's going to come up with the names. These are the names we're going to see in the vSphere web client. So if you don't like these names or if they don't follow your convention, you can go back and change your name, the way you name things, so that it will give you more of a naming convention that you prefer. And then once that's done, we simply review. And we click Finish, and it will go ahead and kick off what's called a workflow. So here you'll see this workflow, create domain. And this workflow, actually, if we expand this out, you'll see that it actually ran about 90 minutes. You'll see it finished here at 4:17 p.m. But you'll see here there's like over 70 some odd tasks that get automated. And so it started at 2:45, so about 90 minutes, a little bit over 90 minutes to create this workload domain. But what's more important is, the automation to create it is nice, but now let's go and let's look at our workload domains. We see our workload domain. This was just created, and we come in here. We can see that the 3 hosts that we assigned are part of it. They were configured into a cluster, and we can also come over here to our vCenter server, and we can now see in our inventory we have this vCenter server with these 3 node cluster. This is what we just created. And again, we created this in about 90 minutes. And then up here in the manager resource pool, you'll see this is where our vCenter server actually runs with our NSX managers. So we do have a management domain where we host all the components that are going to be managing our infrastructure. And that runs outside of the actual workload domain where we're actually going to be running our compute workloads. And because I'm using vSAN, you'll see I do have a vSAN data store. You'll see I do have my virtual distributed switch set up. And if I come back here to the SDDC Manager, you'll see I also have a link out to the NSX Manager where I can log into NSX and verify that, you know what, all those hosts that were put in that cluster, they were also configured for NSX. And I can do that by going to nodes and seeing here that all 3 hosts show up in my list. And they're all up and running. So that is basically how to create a workload domain. Now, getting back to the Kubernetes piece, if we come back here, one of the first steps to enabling Kubernetes is to go and deploy an NSX Edge cluster. And so, again, here, let's go and look at this demo and see how we can use the SDDC Manager to do that. So we're going to pick up where we left off in the other demo, where we go into the VI domain. We have our workload domain here. And you'll see we got our 3 hosts configured in our cluster. But if you go back to that vSphere web client, you'll recall here, there's nothing currently in this cluster. It's just an empty cluster. So what I need to do is I need to set up an NSX Edge cluster. The NSX Edge cluster is what's going to do all my north-south routing and provide my gateway. So this is how components inside the cluster are going to talk out to the internet and how people are going to be able to reach in. It's all going to go through the Edge cluster. As part of this Edge cluster, we're going to create a couple of logical routers, a tier 0 logical router, a tier 1 logical router. So it's a lot kind of goes on here, but we need to create it. And this is a requirement for enabling Kubernetes. And if you go into NSX under Edge Transport Nodes, you'll see we currently don't have one. So the challenge is we need to create an Edge cluster so we can enable Kubernetes. So let's use the SDDC Manager to do that. So we'll come in here under the workload domain, under Actions, you'll see I have Add Edge Cluster. I simply click on that, verify I've met the prerequisites, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to give it a name. And you'll notice here that it's asking me for names for my tier 0 router, my tier 1 router. It's also asking me for an ASN. That's the autonomous system number. That's part of BGP. We do have BGP set up as part of this. It's an option. Then they're going to ask you your profile. We're just going to use the default profile here, and then we're going to provide our passwords for our root, admin, and audit accounts. Okay. Once that's done, we then go in, we specify the type of edge cluster we want to deploy. Now, within the vSphere, if you're working in vSphere and you want to do anything that's related to Kubernetes, that's going to fall under this label of workload management. So you see here, workload management, that's a new term, but essentially what that means is Kubernetes. So are you using this edge cluster for Kubernetes or are you using it for something else? We're doing Kubernetes here. So we're going to go ahead and choose workload management. And then you'll notice that it's going to automatically assume a form factor of large and a configuration of active-active. This is kind of our requirement in there. And then BGP is selected here. Again, it's optional. I could do static, but we will take BGP and leave that option. Once I've done with that, I have to go in and deploy 2 edge transport nodes. And so I need to go in and provide the details for the edge transport nodes. And then for each edge transport node, I'm going to have 2 uplinks. So I'm going to provide details for uplink 1 and then uplink 2. And it really helps when doing this to draw this out, to have a diagram of your environment. So before deploying VCF with Tanzu with the customer, I always sit down, we always draw it out, we always label everything. And then that way, when we're going through these wizards, we can just take those values off that diagram and then we're not left kind of scrambling to find values. So I'll go ahead and do the second interface here. Add that edge node. And of course, for redundancy, we need 2 edge nodes. So we're going to repeat this to add a second edge node. And this is the first uplink, and then we'll do the second uplink, and then we'll add the edge node. Okay, so we got our 2 edge nodes in there, so we'll go ahead and go next, and then we'll just review it, make sure everything's set the way we want, and then we go ahead and it will do some validation. This validation is making sure that everything is, IPs aren't in use or the networks are reachable, gateways are reachable, all those things. So it does quite an extensive list of checks, and then we click finish. And then as with everything in the SDDC Manager, it's going to kick off a workflow. And here you'll see this workflow is running as adding the edge cluster. Now, again, in this demo, it's sped up, but in reality, this took about 20 minutes. So you see here, it finished at about 8:20, and you can go through and see the history of all the tasks that are performed to create that edge cluster. Now, one kind of sidebar note on these workflows. Let's say that in the middle of the workflow, it failed for some reason. Say something wasn't reachable, or I had some type of configuration issue. I didn't have something plugged in the right way, and it failed. You can look at the logs, you can see why it failed. And if you can correct that, then all you got to do is resume the workflow. So it's this idea of having these subtasks built into a workflow provides this very kind of easy way to kick off an activity, and then if it fails, to be able to resume the activity right where it left off. So it's pretty robust in that regard. And so here we have it. Now, if we go back here to our vSphere web client, you'll notice I have this new resource pool in my cluster, and I got my 2 edge transport nodes. So it basically has deployed this edge cluster for us using the SDDC Manager. And we didn't have to log into the NSX Manager. We haven't done anything with the NSX Manager yet. So we're going to go ahead and log into the NSX Manager here, where we're going to click refresh. You're going to see, okay, we have the 2 edge transport nodes. They're configured in the edge cluster. And again, this was all done for us using the automation. And if I go into networking, I can see I have my tier 0 logical router. And of course, we're using BGP, so we can actually go in and we can look at the BGP configuration and verify the BGP is in fact working. And we see we have our tier 1 gateway as well. And so now with this, we now have our edge cluster. So if we come back to our steps here, whoops, where's that? Okay, so we'll come back here to our steps. Okay, we've done step 1, step 2, and now step 3. This is the last one I'm going to be able to show you in the time we have. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post those. But now I'm going to actually show you how we're going to enable Kubernetes.
Kyle, just want to cover something. So all of this so far has relied on SDDC Manager to basically establish that foundation, right? That substrate that you need before you actually get to working with Kubernetes and Tanzu, Kubernetes Grid, et cetera. Okay, that's
exactly.
Great. SDDC Manager. And the workflows, those are all built in, right? That's all just part of SDDC Manager. Those come sort of pre-established. I think they're configurable, right? I mean, because you can change some, you can modify some components that you need to for them. Is that right? I can't remember exactly.
Well, you know, Cloud Foundation is a prescriptive solution, so we do kind of have a specific way of doing things. If you're familiar with the VMware validated design, so if you have questions about, you know, how are we doing NIC redundancy, or how are we doing the uplink networks, how are we handling failure scenarios, that's all part of the VMware validated design. So we have a very specific way that following kind of what we would term as our VMware best recommended practices for implementing this. And we do require that you follow the VMware approach in terms of a lot of that. There is some flexibility in terms of size and numbers and footprint, in terms of, you know, how big are the VMs, how small are the VMs, how many hosts are in a cluster. But aside from that, the workflows are pretty static. You go into the SDDC Manager, you provide your inputs into the wizard, and then it's going to basically go through and execute the workflow. If you need to deviate from that, like say you have hosts that have 4 NICs instead of 2 NICs, and the UI assumes 2 NICs, we do have capabilities in the API where you can use API calls to do some things as well. So there is a moderate level of flexibility, but I would just emphasize that this is a prescriptive approach. And that's intentional, because what we want is we want to give customers a standardized, repeatable way, and a way that's going to ensure success. So we don't want a lot of snowflakes, a lot of customization. We want to take a robust architecture and help customers implement that.
And as you said, there's lots of steps there. What I was really trying to get at was the notion that we've taken care of, you know, having to think about everything that has to happen with the SDDC Manager to establish that environment. And I was aware of validated design, but I knew there were some elements that were configurable for specifics of your environment. So that was good to see.
And to the point you made earlier, this is all built on top of vSphere, NSX, vSAN. And then we haven't really talked about the vRealize integration, but these are the same building blocks that you get if you go out to VMC on AWS, or if you go out and run VMware on Azure, or VMware on Google, or VMware on any public cloud. It's the same building blocks. So we're just doing, through this automation, the same thing that these cloud providers are doing behind the scenes in order to provide this cloud-based service. So that's why we like to think of VMware Cloud Foundation as a private cloud, because we're basically doing this in the on-prem data center. And also, because we built this on VMware, we can now make it very easy to connect this to our public clouds, which are also running on VMware, enable that hybrid cloud. So a lot of times you'll hear us talk about Cloud Foundation in the context of a hybrid cloud or a private cloud. And it's really just a reference to the fact that it's built on the same building blocks that the public cloud providers are using for their VMware offerings as well. And the automation may be slightly different because of different use cases, but it's all essentially the same under the covers.
All right. I'll let you continue.
All right, yeah, so we'll just go ahead now. This is our last demo, and this is where we're actually going to enable Kubernetes. So essentially, we're just going to pick up here where we just left off, where we have our workload domain. Got to get on the right screen here. And so we're just going to do a quick little review here to verify that, yep, our workload domain's here. We have our edge cluster. You'll notice here I have a link out to the SDDC Manager that's on the summary page. Once I've created that edge cluster, I come up here to my vSphere web client. I can verify my edge cluster. I come to NSX and again, just verify that I've met the prerequisites. I have my nodes or configured my edge cluster. So now I want to go ahead and I want to enable Kubernetes. So to do that, from the SDDC Manager, I go to Solutions and I'm going to click Deploy. And there's a list of prerequisites here. Most of these are around networking. So we've already got the edge cluster. We've already got the workload domain. We've got our licensing. So the one we haven't talked about is this IP addressing. So there will be some IP addressing you'll have to assign. In preparation for this, you want to have those reserved. And then you're going to go in and you're going to select your workload domain. So we only have one workload domain in this example. We'll select it. And it's going to go out and it's going to do some validation in the context of VCF to make sure that the workload domain is healthy, make sure nothing's in maintenance mode, make sure you don't have any errors or issues. And so it's basically going to do some checks. And these checks are going to help us to ensure we have successful deployment. Now, you'll notice here that everything's successful. And when you come here, you'll notice that this is going to be where we make a transition. So we're going to leave the SDDC Manager and go to the vSphere client, because this is where we make that jump from VCF to vSphere. So vSphere with Tanzu is our ability to run Kubernetes on top of vSphere 7. And VCF with Tanzu is just kind of providing this infrastructure around, this automation around the underlying infrastructure to make it easy to consume vSphere with Tanzu. So we'll go into the vSphere web client here. And here we've switched over. We're now on the vSphere web client. And we'll go ahead and this is where we actually configure Kubernetes. So I go in, I select my workload domain. I got to pick my size. So in this Kubernetes clusters, it's going to create some VMs. It's going to create 3 VMs specifically. We call these the supervisor control plane VMs. And this is asking, how big do you want these to be in terms of CPU, memory, and storage? And the answer to what you should select depends on how big you expect your environment to be in terms of number of pods to be deployed. In this example, I chose small. And then we'll go in and we're going to give it some networking. And this is our management network. This is basically, we're going to deploy these control plane VMs, put them on the management network. They're going to have network connectivity, access to DNS. So we got to provide those networking details. Then we're going to go in and we're going to provide Kubernetes networking. And so this is where we go in and we provide our virtual distributed switch, our edge cluster, which we just created. And then these are those IP addresses that I was telling you where they're in the prerequisites. We have to provide 4 sets of IP addresses. 2 are internal, non-routable. That's our pods and our services. And you'll notice that these actually default. And you can take those defaults and use them. And you can also change them if you want. And then there's the ingress and egress. And that's our routable networks that are going to be used to get access out and into the Kubernetes environments running in our vSphere with Tanzu enabled workload domain. So that's kind of a lot to kind of get through. So if you're new to this, just be aware that you need to assign some IP address ranges. These are actually going to be translated into NSX objects and be configured inside NSX so that as we create Kubernetes clusters, they'll be allocated in blocks. And so basically what this is it's setting it up so that NSX has all the information it needs so it can do its own IP address management as you scale out your Kubernetes environment. So we'll go ahead and go in. We're going to select our storage. And again, there's different types of storage. You can have different storage policies for the different types of objects. In this example, I'm using the same storage policy for all 3. But in a production environment, if you have a lot of different storage types and stuff, you may not want to put some things that don't need redundancy on your expensive vSAN storage, for example. So this is just giving you that option. In small labs like mine, where I only have one type of storage, we just use the same thing. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to click Finish. And now it's going to go out and it's actually going to enable Kubernetes on this workload domain. And you'll see here that it comes up. I see this screen configuring and I can go out. I'm at the web client. I can see these are where it deploys these supervisor control plane VMs. Now, a quick note on the supervisor control plane VMs. Oftentimes, when you're talking to VMware, talking to guys like me, you'll hear us make a reference to a supervisor cluster. Okay, so what is a supervisor cluster? Well, it's simply a reference to a vSphere cluster where Kubernetes has been enabled. And the reason why we use that term supervisor cluster has to do with the name of those VMs, the supervisor control plane VM. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and now that we've got it done and enabled, let's go into our vSphere web client, and here you'll see that I actually have, now this is that namespaces. Remember what the namespaces are? That's how we're going to control access, and that's how we're going to manage resource limits. It's done inside the namespace. So you see the namespaces. Here's our supervisor control plane VMs. And again, that's why we call it a supervisor cluster. And if I come back here now and I go into my workload management, remember, workload management in vSphere is the term we use to refer to the Kubernetes capabilities. So I go into workload management, and the first step, I need to create a namespace. Okay. And so that kind of takes us to the end of this demo. And then you'll see here I have additional demos for creating the namespace, as well as going in and showing how developers can access and deploy. I'm happy to, we got a few minutes. I could take one of those if we want to see one of those, or if there's any questions or discussion, I'm happy to take any of that as well.
I think that's probably where we need to end today, Kyle, but we can figure out a time to come back and look at some of the rest of this. It's all really, really interesting in terms of understanding what it takes to set up and run Kubernetes on vSphere. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, and if I just kind of wrap up with a quick summary, my message to vSphere admins out there is don't be intimidated by Kubernetes. With vSphere with Tanzu and together with Cloud Foundation with Tanzu, we really make it easy for you to get started. So yes, Kubernetes is a new world. These modern applications are kind of new, and there's a lot to get around. But by leveraging the automation of the SDDC Manager together with the built-in Kubernetes capabilities of vSphere with Tanzu, it's really your fast path to getting started with Kubernetes in your data center.
Cool.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kyle. Yeah, and if you have any further questions, or if you're looking for additional information, please feel free to go to the VMware website, where you can find resources about VMware Cloud Foundation with Tanzu. And we'll also be updating the YouTube link with some of these resources that we've covered in the demonstration today. So just to close with a reminder, if you're interested in seeing more demos and additional multi-cloud solutions and even follow-ups on this topic, please subscribe to the channel, and we'll be featuring those new sessions each week. Any final thoughts from everyone?
Kyle, any final things you want to cover?
No, other than just, I hope everybody found this useful. Do go out to core.vmware.com, and remember there's lots of resources out there, not just about Cloud Foundation, but about vSAN and about just the core vSphere capabilities as well. Check back often, as we're constantly refreshing and updating. Right now I'm working on some integration where I'm actually showing how to log into vRealize automation and use the vRealize automation to deploy workloads inside of Tanzu-enabled clusters as well. So that stuff will be forthcoming as well.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much, Kyle, for being with us today. We
thank
really
you.
Enjoyed it. I've learned a lot, and really love what how much of this SDDC Manager takes care of for folks. I mean, I know it would be some of those workflows were as you said 80 steps or so, and it's really nice to have that fully automated for you and do it in a best practice way, so it's going to work. It's awesome.
Yeah. All right, great. Okay, thank you.
All right, Lauren, back to you, and whatever else, and then we can finish up.
Yeah, that's all for today. Thanks, everyone. This will be available as a recording on our VMware Multi-Cloud YouTube channel. So if you weren't able to check it out live, you can check it out on demand and see what's coming up in the following weeks as well. So thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you, David. And hope to see you next time.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone.